Welcome to Dead Quiet Mysteries, the place where every cold case, chilling crime, and unsolved mystery is brought back to life. From vanished persons to twisted betrayals, we dig deep into the unknown to uncover the truth that others left buried. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell us which city and country you're watching from. We love seeing how far the mystery travels. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell icon so you never miss a case. Because here, some truths are only heard in the dead quiet. Father Brown and the Shadow in the Belfry. Chapter 1. The Silence at Skelbrooke. Skelbrooke was the sort of English village where centuries hung like ivy on old stone. Its cottages, nestled close as secrets, bore sloping roofs of weathered slate and walls faded by rain and time. Each house seemed slightly askew, as if bowing in quiet reverence to the land's enduring memory. Smoke curled from ancient chimneys, and the lanes, cobbled, crooked, and softly muddied, meandered between mossy walls that had outlived their builders. At the village heart stood St. Etheldreda's, a church too old to be proud. Its tower leaned faintly westward, weathered by wind and repentance, while the bell, cast in the time of Henry VIII, hung like a solemn tongue in the ivy-bound belfry. It had tolled through births, burials, wars, and winters, but on the morning of the feast of St. Michael, it tolled once, and not by hand. That morning dawned beneath a thick autumnal mist, blanketing the moors and hedgerows in a hush. The air tasted of damp stone and distant bonfires. Mr. Amos Hallett, the verger, a man as square as the pews he dusted, arrived early, as he always did. He carried a brass key as heavy as a sermon, and a sense of duty carved in granite. Yet it was not he who stirred the silence, but something older, darker. At 6:30, as he prepared the altar for matins, Hallett heard it, a single toll from the great bell above. It echoed down the nave like a sudden question, unwanted and unanswered. He froze, brass candlestick in hand. His ears pricked for footsteps or voices, but none came. The belfry door, when he reached it, was bolted from the inside. No one could have entered. Or so it seemed. By 7, the blacksmith had been summoned. With a crowbar and reluctant strength, the lock gave way, and a creak of ancient hinges opened the tower's throat. What greeted them was not noise, but stillness. Hanging from the thick rope that ran through the bell wheel was the limp body of Peter Alnwick, the curate. He hung as if thoughtfully placed, not frenzied nor flailing. His thin figure swayed gently, robes brushing the stone floor, face half turned to the narrow window where mist still clung like breath upon glass. The bell above him rocked slightly, its motion as subtle as guilt. A stool, tipped on its side, lay several feet away. By mid-morning, a physician from Dunthorpe and the village constable had arrived. They examined the body, noted the clean mark around the neck, the lack of bruising on the wrists or arms, and declared with a kind of bureaucratic weariness that it was suicide. He was a solitary sort, the doctor said, withdrawn, not uncommon among those who think too much and speak too little. The villagers agreed. Alnwick had always seemed elsewhere. His sermons were precise but passionless, full of obscure references to desert fathers and Byzantine councils. Children found him strange, women found him unreadable. Men, if they thought of him at all, called him clever, though few could say what he believed in. He had come to Skelbrooke 2 years prior, recommended by the diocese after a quiet departure from Oxford. The vicar, Reverend Chatterton, who had been ill for some weeks, was too frail to comment. Most turned instead to the bishop's temporary replacement, a squat, mild-faced man named Father Brown. Father Brown had arrived unceremoniously with little luggage and even less fuss. He wore a shabby brown cassock, carried a black umbrella with a curved handle, and had the quiet habit of making himself unnoticed in any room. Most had assumed him a functionary, a stopgap until Chatterton returned, or a more fashionable curate could be found. Yet now, in the shadow of death, he moved with a peculiar gravity. He climbed the tower steps alone after the constable had finished. No one questioned him. His footsteps echoed faintly as he ascended, his round figure lost in the dim stairwell. At the top, he paused, peering around the space with eyes behind thick spectacles that missed little. The bell loomed above him, flecked with verdigris. He ran a hand along the fraying rope and stopped at a knot, newer than the rest, tied in a different manner. He frowned thoughtfully, then knelt near the stool, tilting his head. It had fallen backward, not forward. A small detail, but Father Brown had long learned to listen to small details. They often whispered truths louder than shouts. He tapped the floorboards with his umbrella, listening to the sound, hollow in parts, solid in others. He looked again at the beam where the rope passed, then at the narrow window. Too small to climb through, certainly. But it offered a view. Of what, he wondered? The mist had lifted slightly. From here one could just see the lane winding toward Greystoke Manor, a mile or so distant. He descended slowly, passing Hallett on the way down. "A terrible thing, Father," said the verger. "But perhaps he's found peace now." "Perhaps," said Father Brown gently. "Though peace, like truth, rarely falls from the sky." Hallett furrowed his brow. "Do you think he didn't do it then?" Father Brown didn't answer directly. He looked up the spiral stairs and said, "I think we should be careful about the stories we tell the dead. They can no longer correct us." In the churchyard, Father Brown paused by the lich gate. A rook cawed above, as if echoing some unspoken verdict. The graveyard was quiet but not serene, more like a theatre waiting for the next scene. He turned, eyes drifting back to the tower. Why hang oneself there? Why go through the effort alone in the dark, when the rectory was but a few steps away and the garden offered equal solitude? And why did the bell toll only once? It was not easy for a falling body to move it at all, let alone with such precise timing. No suicide note had been found, no journal left open in confession. The only thing discovered in his room was a half-burnt candle and an open Bible, its pages fluttered to the book of Job. Father Brown closed his eyes a moment. Not in weariness, but in thought. Job had cursed the day of his birth, yet never took his life. That too was a kind of clue. By evening, the village had folded the event into its rhythm, whispering the tale in bakeries, and beside fires, some mourned, a few speculated. Most accepted the suicide as sad but not surprising. After all, Alnwick had never belonged, not really. But Father Brown remained unconvinced. In his experience, those who killed themselves often did so out of despair. But despair had a voice. A silence like Alnwick's felt silenced. That night, long after candles had been snuffed and windows shuttered, Father Brown sat beneath the stone arch of the church, watching stars struggle against mist. In his lap, the umbrella rested like a sleeping hound. He did not pray aloud, but he considered heaven nonetheless. Not for answers, but for the courage to ask better questions. Chapter 2. Greystoke's Shadows. The day after Peter Alnwick's death dawned clearer than the one before. The mist had retreated to the edges of the moor, like a beast unwilling to leave, but the skies over Skelbrooke were a watery blue, and the sun, though pale, cast faint warmth upon the damp flagstones. Villagers resumed their routines, the shock of the tragedy softening into rumour, and the question of suicide quietly folded into cups of tea and murmured prayers. But Father Brown did not fold it away. After matins, he took a quiet breakfast of porridge and toast in the vicarage kitchen, thanked the housekeeper with his usual warm nod, and set out along the lane toward Greystoke Manor. Greystoke was the largest estate in the area, a brooding edifice of brick and ivy, half Elizabethan and half regret. Its tall gables and narrow windows looked over the land like the eyes of a stern ancestor. The family that had lived there for generations, descendants of an ancient Catholic line, was now reduced to a few surviving members and one unnervingly silent butler. Lady Agnes Greystoke received Father Brown in the drawing-room, a chamber of long curtains and family portraits so faded they resembled ghosts. She was a woman of 50, with a tall frame and a face carved by both elegance and stubbornness. "I didn't expect a social call, Father," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "It's not entirely social," Father Brown replied. "I believe Peter Alnwick was often here." Lady Agnes raised a brow. "He dined with us occasionally, yes. My nephew particularly admired him. They had long discussions about the fathers and the darker corners of Augustine." "Your nephew, Mr. Maurice Greystoke?" "Yes. He's in the library now, though I must warn you he's taken the news hard. Sensitive boy, idealistic." Father Brown smiled faintly. "Idealism and grief often walk together. I'd like to speak with him." Lady Agnes rang the bell with one long finger. When the butler appeared, silent as a shadow, she simply said, "The library." Maurice Greystoke was perhaps 30, with a scholar's build, narrow shoulders, long hands, and the sallow complexion of someone who lived more in books than in gardens. He greeted Father Brown politely, but without warmth. "I suppose you've come to question the faith of the dead," he said, gesturing at the armchair across from him. "Not his faith," Father Brown said gently. "Just the facts," Maurice frowned. "Then you're wasting your time." Peter was ill in spirit. He often said so. He was tormented by questions the church had long since buried. "What sort of questions?" Maurice waved vaguely. "Original sin, predestination, whether mercy can undo justice. He said once that God's silence terrified him more than his wrath." "That is a subtle fear," said Father Brown, "and a dangerous one." Maurice leaned forward. "You think he didn't take his life?" "I think the rope may have held more than one weight." Maurice sat back, pale. After a silence, Father Brown continued, "Was he in any difficulty? Financial, moral, academic?" "Not that I know of, though he once hinted at trouble in Oxford. Said he had to leave in a hurry, never elaborated." Father Brown nodded slowly. "Thank you. Might I see his study here?" Maurice hesitated. He often used the west room upstairs. He said the view of the woods calmed him. The room was spare, a desk, a chair, and a bookshelf. Father Brown examined the titles: Kierkegaard, Pascal, Dante, Aquinas, a worn copy of The Imitation of Christ. There was a stack of letters neatly tied, and a bottle of ink, half congealed. On the desk lay a half-written note. "We are not always the authors of our guilt, but we may yet be the editors." The rest trailed off. Father Brown tapped the desk with his umbrella. "Do you mind if I take this?" Maurice shrugged. "It's yours if it helps." As Father Brown left, he paused once more before Lady Agnes. "Do you believe he would have done such a thing?" he asked. She looked toward the windows where the trees stirred slightly. "I believe he was capable of despair, but not cowardice. And hanging oneself from a bell rope—" She shivered faintly. "That feels like a performance, not a surrender." Father Brown bowed slightly. "Thank you, Lady Agnes. That may be the clearest thing I've heard all day." On his way back through the village, he passed a group of children playing with hoops. One stopped and pointed. "That's the man who talks to dead people," the boy cried. Father Brown chuckled. "No, my boy, I talk to the living, but sometimes it's the dead who answer." At the church, he stopped by the belfry once more. He opened the door, stepped inside, and stared at the beam. The frayed rope, the stool still there. Then he turned, and for the first time walked toward the vestry. He had remembered something from a sermon Alnwick gave 3 Sundays ago. A strange phrase. "The weight of the soul lies not in its sins, but in what it hides." That was not a quote from Scripture. It was personal. And if Peter Alnwick was hiding something, perhaps it had not died with him. Father Brown knelt briefly, not for prayer, but to retrieve a small scrap from the floor. It was a button, ornate, not from a cassock. He tucked it into his pocket. Outside, the sun broke more fully through the trees. Truth, like light, is patient, but it will find its window. Chapter 3. The Button and the Bell. A button is a small thing. It fastens, it closes, it holds. But in the right or wrong place, it can also unlock. Father Brown walked with measured steps along the path that wound past St. Etheldrada's churchyard. The ornate button nestled in his pocket like a secret whisper. The village had largely resumed its gentle murmurings, though the shadow of the curate's death lingered like the mist that clung to the lower hedgerows. Death had visited Skelbrooke, but had not, it seemed, taken all its meaning with it. By mid-morning, Father Brown stood in the small parlour of the local constable, Mr. Reeve, a man of honest intentions and limited imagination. The room smelled faintly of pipe smoke and bacon. "I don't see how a button's any business of the police," Reeve said, examining the item between stubby fingers. "Could have been there for weeks. The belfry's open enough." "True," Father Brown said gently. "But this isn't the sort of button one loses without noticing. It's brass, engraved. Military issue, I'd guess." "Look closely. See the crown?" Reeve squinted. "Well, I'll ask around, but that still doesn't mean it has anything to do with the unfortunate business." Father Brown nodded. "Of course not. But it was near the beam, and near the rope." Reeve shifted in his chair. "Still think it wasn't suicide?" "I think despair is clever, but not always theatrical," Father Brown replied. "And Peter Alnwick was a troubled man, not a dramatic one. The bell only rang once. The stool was placed, oddly. And now this button." The constable sighed. "I don't know what you're after, Father, but I'll keep it on file." "Thank you, Mr. Reeve," said Father Brown with his usual warm civility. "Sometimes files are where the truth hibernates." Leaving the constable's cottage, he headed back through the narrow lanes. He passed Mrs. Wetherall, who paused in trimming her hedges to comment, "Terrible business, Father." "They say he was too clever for his own good." Father Brown nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Intelligence was not always a blessing. It could make a man proud, restless, even blind. As he approached the vicarage, he saw a figure waiting at the gate, a woman wrapped in a navy cloak, her face drawn with some mixture of anxiety and intent. She was young, perhaps 30, with strikingly dark eyes and a posture that belied gentility. "You are Father Brown?" she asked. "Yes," he said, smiling. "And you are?" "Veronica Delamere. I was once close to Mr. Alnwick." He gestured her inside. In the sitting room she declined tea, though her hands trembled slightly. "I wasn't sure if I should come," she began, "but I saw your face the day it happened. You didn't look surprised. You looked listening." Father Brown inclined his head. "Sometimes silence tells us things words won't." She gave a soft laugh, almost bitter. "Peter used to say that." "You knew him well?" "We were engaged," she said, simply. "Once, before he came to Skelbrooke. It ended badly, but we wrote sparingly. I received a letter from him 3 days before he died. She handed it to Father Brown. The paper was thin, the writing spidery but elegant. Dearest Veronica, there are things I have done which have no name in confession, and things I have feared which no cross can dispel. I am not well, but more than that I am hunted, not by man, but by the consequences of my weakness. I have seen something I should not have. Perhaps you will forgive me some day, or at least pity me. If I fall, know it was not willingly. Father Brown read it twice. May I keep this? She nodded. I don't know what he meant, but it doesn't sound like suicide, does it? No, Father Brown murmured. It sounds like someone watching a curtain descend too early. Later that day, Father Brown visited the schoolhouse where Alnwick had sometimes taught catechism to the village children. Miss Lilibet Frost, the schoolmistress, was a lean, nervous woman with an encyclopedic memory for trivialities and an eye that twitched when she lied. Oh yes, she said. Mr. Alnwick was very committed, although toward the end he became distracted. He would stare out the windows for long stretches. He said the trees were speaking in tongues. Father Brown made a small note. Did he ever mention anyone following him? Her eye twitched. No, no one. Did you ever meet a man in uniform visiting him? Her hands stilled. Once, a month ago, he came in the evening, tall, loud voice, wore an overcoat and gloves even though it was warm, they argued. Did you catch his name? But he had a scar on his cheek, like a knife wound. Father Brown's pen paused. Then he said very softly, Thank you, Miss Frost. You've been very helpful. That night, in the vicarage study, Father Brown laid the pieces out like puzzle tiles. The frayed rope, the single toll of the bell, the button, the half-written note, the letter to Veronica, the argument with a scarred man in uniform. He spoke aloud as if to some invisible presence in the lamplight. He was being followed, threatened, perhaps blackmailed. He feared something, not just divine judgment, but a worldly consequence. The bell had tolled once, not rung, just enough to draw attention. Someone else was there. Someone who knew the tower well. Perhaps knew how to knot a rope convincingly. Perhaps even wanted it to look like suicide. And then there was the button. It came not from the vestments of the clergy, nor from any villager, but from someone official once, military or constabulary. He remembered Maurice Greystoke's manner, intelligent, grief-stricken, but also evasive. And the West Room. Why would a curate use a private study in a manor house? Father Brown mused. Unless someone wanted him close, or wanted to keep an eye on him. The manor held secrets, but so did Peter Alnwick. And sometimes the hiding of guilt becomes the most dangerous guilt of all. Father Brown opened his drawer and placed the button beside the letter, one cold, metallic, the other warm with human fear. Truth, he thought again, will find its window. And this window at Skelbrooke was slowly beginning to open. Chapter 4. The Study in the West Wing. Greystoke Manor stood like an old man's pride, broad-chested, aloof, and slightly crumbling at the edges. Its stone facade bore the scars of centuries, ivy curling like veins across its flank. Inside, the West Wing had once housed visitors of noble blood, military distinction, and more recently, faded wealth. Now it was quiet, dusty, and, according to its current lord, of no particular use. Father Brown was shown in by Mrs. Penley, the housekeeper, whose tight bun and pursed mouth suggested a temperament unswayed by theological charm. Yet even she looked uncertain when she opened the west study door. This was where the young curate sometimes worked, she said, Lord Greystoke allowed it, said it might do the lad some good. Books, solitude, though I never saw the point. Father Brown nodded, stepping into the chamber. It was a long, narrow room with high windows, their panes clouded by time and weather. Bookshelves lined the far wall, flanking a fireplace with a carved oak mantel. The air smelt faintly of old paper and polish. At the centre stood a writing desk, its surface neat but oddly impersonal. Father Brown examined the inkwell, the open Bible, a few slips of paper with scribbled theological references. Then, under the blotter, he found something more revealing. A torn envelope bearing an unfamiliar crest. He turned to Mrs. Penley. "Do you know this seal?" She squinted. "Army, I think. Lord Greystoke's regiment, if I'm not mistaken." Father Brown said nothing, but pocketed the envelope. As he turned to leave, something on the carpet caught his eye. A faint trail, perhaps of damp boots, leading from the far bookshelf to the study door. Curious, he moved to the shelf and ran his hand along the spines. One book, a dusty edition of Pascal's Pensées, protruded slightly. He pulled it, and a soft click echoed. A panel in the wall creaked ajar. Behind it was a narrow recess, little more than a cupboard, but it held something unexpected, a tattered valise and a revolver wrapped in cloth. Father Brown stood for a long moment, then closed the panel and restored the book. Later that day, he requested an audience with Lord Maurice Greystoke. The young aristocrat received him in a faded sitting-room over tea, which he poured with impeccable, if slightly trembling, hands. "I understand you used to be in the military," Father Brown began. Greystoke's face tightened. "Yes, Guards Regiment, why?" "Did Peter Alnwick know that?" "I imagine so, it's not a secret." Father Brown studied him. "And this West study, it was your idea?" "Yes, he seemed fragile. I thought space might help." The vicarage was cold and cluttered. Father Brown sipped his tea. "Did you ever lend him books?" Greystoke hesitated. "A few. I think he liked Pascal." "Do you know anything about a man with a scar on his cheek who visited Mr. Alnwick recently?" There was a beat of silence. Then Greystoke said, "No." "Why do you ask?" Father Brown set down his cup gently. "Because someone frightened him. Enough to write a letter about being hunted, enough to make him retreat here, enough, perhaps, to make him confide in you." Greystoke stood. His voice was tight. "Father, are you accusing me of something?" "No," said Father Brown quietly. "But I think Peter saw something he shouldn't have, something connected to someone he trusted." Greystoke walked to the window. "He told me he had once heard a confession, a genuine confession, not in a box, but in a drunken muttering at a retreat. Something about a cover-up, a death in service. It haunted him. And he couldn't let it go," Father Brown said. "He said truth wasn't something you could unknow, even when it made you complicit by silence." Father Brown nodded slowly. "The weapon, the letter, the bell, it all forms a shape, if not yet a picture." "Then I hope, for all our sakes, it's a picture that ends in forgiveness," Greystoke said, but his eyes were far away. That evening, Father Brown walked to the church alone. The bell tower rose above him like a relic, dark and brooding. He unlocked the belfry and climbed the steps. Each creak of the stones sounded like a question. At the top, he knelt beside the beam where the rope had been tied. Then he lit a match and examined the pulley closely. Something glittered faintly. It was a shaving of brass. He held it in his palm, considering. A stage had been set. Someone had engineered the scene with meticulous care. The stool tipped, the rope sliced and reknotted, the bell nudged to toll once, a singular toll, a mockery of a funeral chime. The curate had not hanged himself. He had been hanged, And the killer wanted it to be seen as suicide, but also wanted it to be found. Guilt, Father Brown thought, rarely wants to be buried too deep. In the churchyard below, the wind stirred, leaves scattered like whispers across the grass. Father Brown closed the tower door behind him and stood in the nave, whispering a prayer, not for the dead alone, but for the living who must face the weight of what they've done. The mystery was clearer now, but not yet resolved. There were still masks to be removed, motives to be sifted. He lit a candle at the altar and bowed his head. "Lord," he murmured, "grant me the eyes to see what pride has hidden, and the mercy to meet the truth with gentleness." Then he turned and walked out into the dusk, his figure small against the broadening dark, but steady. The real bell, he thought, has yet to toll. Chapter 5. The Confession in the Garden. The garden behind Greystoke Manor had once been a place of beauty, but now it bore the forlorn air of something half-remembered. Ivy had overwhelmed the stone walls, and the hedgerows grew wild with thistle and rose. Still, in the late afternoon light, the fading blooms and long shadows lent it a solemn kind of grace. It was here that Father Brown found Miss Veronica Delamere. She sat on a wrought-iron bench near the sundial, her figure statuesque, though her face showed signs of fatigue. Her gloved hands were folded neatly in her lap, and she turned only slightly as Father Brown approached. "You walk lightly, Father," she said, her tone clipped, but not unkind. "I try not to disturb what listens in gardens," he replied with a small smile. "The birds, the ivy, the ghosts." Her brow furrowed. "You believe in ghosts?" He sat beside her, careful not to crowd. "Oh yes, but they are not the dead. They are our own regrets pacing back and forth behind our thoughts." She turned away, but not before he saw the faintest twitch of emotion. After a moment she said, "You came to speak of Peter Alnwick?" "I came to listen," said Father Brown. Veronica let out a long breath. "He wasn't meant for this world. Not really. He carried everything too close to the skin." "You were friends?" "Yes, though I'm not sure he thought of it that way. He had walls, but he confided in me more than others." More." Father Brown nodded slowly. "Did he tell you what troubled him?" She hesitated, then reached into her coat and produced a folded piece of paper. "He left this in one of my books. I only found it after the tower." Father Brown took it gently. It was written in a tight, neat hand. "There are secrets in Greystoke, in the house and in the hearts of those within it. I am being followed, or I believe I am. A man with a scar, but also something worse, a silence, a shared silence. They think I will not speak, but silence is not my vow." He read it twice, then folded it and returned it. "Did he say who they were?" "Number. But he seemed afraid of Lord Greystoke, not hatred, more a kind of haunted reverence, as if Maurice had done something noble once and now must live beneath the weight of it." Father Brown tilted his head. "That sounds like a peculiar sort of guilt." "It is. The guilt of the righteous who stumble." They sat in silence as the shadows lengthened. Then Veronica spoke again. "I believe Peter knew of something that happened in the war. Maurice never speaks of his service, not in any detail, but I've seen him wake from dreams, gasping, shivering." Father Brown's gaze did not waver. "Men carry many wounds from war. Some bleed inside the soul." "I asked Peter once if he believed in evil," she said suddenly. "He said evil was too grand a word. He said people do harm not out of malice, but confusion, and that truth has a way of unmasking those confusions." Father Brown rose, brushing moss from his cassock. "Miss Delamere, you are braver than most. Thank you for your honesty." As he left the garden, he turned once more, to the sundial, the shadow lay long across its face, pointing eastward toward the bell tower. That evening, the village square hosted a modest fair. Stalls were arranged with gingerbread, ribbons, and jars of gooseberry jam. Children darted between wagons, and the local fiddler played reels beneath a hanging lantern. It was the sort of gathering meant to banish sorrow through merriment. Father Brown wandered the fair with quiet attentiveness. His eyes passed over the sweetmeats and spinning wheels, but he paused when he saw a figure in the crowd, a man in a dark overcoat with a sharp cheekbone and a faint scar. The man moved like someone used to scrutiny, yet indifferent to it. He purchased a glass of cider and stood near the edge of the crowd, his eyes fixed on no one in particular. Father Brown approached with his characteristic casualness. "Evening," he said. The man glanced at him, wary. "Good evening." "You're not from around here?" "Number passing through. You knew Mr. Alnwick?" The man stiffened. "No." Strange, he thought he was being followed. The man's eyes darkened. If he said that, he was mad. Father Brown's gaze softened. "You know, it's a curious thing. People often lie to cover up crimes, but more often they lie to cover up fears." The man said nothing. "Who are you protecting?" Father Brown asked gently. The scarred man gave a crooked smile. "I'm not answering any more questions." He turned and disappeared into the milling crowd. Later that night, Father Brown sat in the empty church, the candlelight flickering against the stained glass. He was not praying, at least not aloud, but thinking, as he often did, with a kind of sacred patience. He now saw the outline more clearly. Peter Alnwick had uncovered something. An old wartime incident, perhaps, or a crime hidden beneath layers of honor and shame. He had confided in Veronica and possibly in Greystoke, but fear had driven him to isolation, and perhaps into the path of someone desperate to keep the past buried. He considered the weapon in the West Wing, the torn letter, the silence of the scarred man, and most of all, the bell. That bell had not tolled in mourning. It had tolled in warning. Father Brown's hand closed gently around the crucifix on his chest. "We are nearing the truth," he murmured, "but truth, like judgment, must wait its hour." Outside, the fair's music died away, and the stars over Skelbrooke blinked like the eyes of 1,000 watchful saints. The time for answers would come. But first, one more door needed to be opened. One final soul needed to speak. Chapter 6. The Door That Would Not Close. The manor's west wing had always been something of a legend. Built during the reign of George III and unused for decades, its shuttered windows and draughty halls had become the source of whispered stories among the village children. Some said a madwoman once lived there, others that Lord Greystoke's father died screaming in one of its rooms. In truth, it had simply become forgotten, locked up, dusty and untouched. But on the morning following the fair, the lock was broken. Mr. Hallett, the verger, was the first to see it. He had come early to check the church linens and noticed the side door to the manor's west corridor was ajar. When he nudged it open, the hinges groaned like an old man rising from bed. Inside, the hallway was choked with dust. The air held the brittle smell of old wallpaper and time. Yet someone had clearly been here. There were footprints in the thick carpet. One window had been unlatched, letting in the faint scent of honeysuckle from the garden below. Within the hour, Father Brown stood in the west wing, his round face calm but alert. Lord Greystoke was beside him, pale and rigid, holding a lamp that cast jagged shadows. "I had no idea this was disturbed," Greystoke muttered. "We haven't used this part of the house since my mother's passing. Why would anyone?" Father Brown did not answer immediately. He moved from room to room with gentle purpose, pausing to study the discoloured walls and the warped floors. In one chamber, he stopped altogether. This room differed subtly. The furniture was modest, a narrow bed, a desk with a broken quill, and a single armchair facing the fireplace. But what caught Father Brown's attention was the faint circle of cleaner wood on the desk's surface, where something had been recently removed. He bent down and ran a finger along the dust, then examined the hearth. Ashes had been stirred, not by time, but by hands, clumsy ones. "What was kept here?" he asked. Greystoke squinted. "Books, mostly. Some family correspondence. I suppose there were a few journals. Anything Peter Alnwick might have found interesting." There was a pause, too long for comfort. "I suppose Peter was curious. He asked questions. I thought it was theological curiosity." Father Brown stepped toward the fireplace. "You know, I've found that what men fear most isn't punishment, but the look in another's eyes when they see who you really are." Greystoke flinched. "Are you accusing me, Father?" "No," said Brown softly. "Only observing that something here frightened a man who was already very alone." Greystoke turned sharply and walked out. Father Brown remained behind, kneeling briefly to study the ashes. Then he stood and moved to the door. As he reached for the knob, he noticed something strange. The brass handle was worn smooth, unlike the untouched fittings elsewhere in the wing. Someone had come here regularly. Outside, the sky had turned a restless grey. Rain was coming. Father Brown returned to the church, where he found the scarred man, Mr. Hollow, waiting. He looked uneasy. "I want to speak," he said flatly. "Not because I fear arrest, but because something is broken, and I thought silence could mend it." Father Brown nodded once. "Come." They sat in the vestry. The man removed his cap, revealing thinning hair and eyes sunk deep in shadow. "My name is Lucas Hollow. I served under Lord Greystoke. Palestine, 1917. There was a skirmish near Beersheba. Not much written about it. We were ambushed. Greystoke led us out. He was brave, clever too." He paused, licking dry lips. "But afterward, something happened. One of our men, a chaplain like you, found some letters among the enemy dead, letters in English, proof that someone had betrayed our position. He wanted to take them to command." Father Brown's voice was very quiet. "And what did Lord Greystoke say?" "He said we had a duty to morale, that exposing a traitor among our own would tear the regiment apart." The chaplain argued, loudly. Next morning, he was found shot. Officially, he died in the skirmish, but it was no bullet from the enemy. "And Greystoke knew?" "He knew. He made us vow silence. I kept that vow until now." Father Brown bowed his head, then looked up with a kind but piercing gaze. "And Peter Alnwick?" He found the chaplain's journal in the West Wing. Greystoke's mother had preserved it, oddly. Peter confronted him. He wasn't angry. He just wanted the truth told. "What did Greystoke do?" "I don't know, but 2 days later, Peter was dead." They sat in heavy silence. Eventually, Father Brown said, "Do you believe Peter killed himself?" "No." Then the question becomes, who helped him die or who arranged for it? Lucas Hollow stood, his eyes glistening. "I failed once. I won't again." Father Brown gently placed a hand on his arm. "Confession is not the end, it's the beginning." That evening, Father Brown walked alone to the Belfry. He climbed the steps with care. The light through the high window had faded to a smoky violet. He studied the beam again, and the pulley. Then he knelt and felt beneath the floorboards. There it was, a sliver of wax, and the faint scent of oil. The bell rope had not snapped from strain. It had been deliberately tampered with, waxed, and waited to swing once, and sees a signal or a staged drama. He descended, stepping quietly into the chancel, where Veronica Delamere knelt in prayer. "You suspect something?" she said without turning. "I do, but I also hope." "For what?" "That the living may find peace in the truth, however bitter." She rose. "Then speak it soon, Father, before the truth becomes just another ghost." Father Brown walked into the darkening churchyard, the wind rising through the yew trees. He paused by Peter Alnwick's grave, freshly dug, the soil dark and damp. "I see now," he murmured. "He died not from despair, but from someone else's idea of honour." He turned toward Greystoke Manor, where lights flickered in uneasy rhythm. The door that would not close had been opened, and the past, long sealed, was blowing in like a storm. Chapter 7. A Question of Honour. Rain lashed the stained glass windows of St. Etheldreda's like 1,000 small knives. Within, the nave was dim and chill, candles flickering in protest to the rising wind. Father Brown sat alone in the front pew, his hands folded not in prayer, but thought. On the altar lay an open psalter, forgotten, its ribbon askew. The hour was late, and the storm showed no signs of mercy. A knock sounded at the vestry door. He rose, waddled softly across the chancel, and opened it. Lord Greystoke stood there, his overcoat soaked, his face colourless. "You knew I would come," he said. "I hoped you would," replied Father Brown simply, stepping aside. Greystoke entered and looked around as though seeing the church anew. "This place, it never changes." "That is its purpose," Father Brown said, "to be still, even when we are not." Greystoke removed his gloves slowly, his fingers trembling. "I must speak, not because you ask it, but because it's become unbearable." Father Brown waited. "I did not kill Peter Alnwick, not by hand, but I set in motion the chain of things that led him to death." "Tell me," said the priest gently. Greystoke walked to the altar rail and placed his palms on the cold stone. "He came to me 3 weeks ago, said he'd found a journal in the West Wing, a chaplain's from the war. He was calm but persistent. He asked if the contents were true. And were they?" Greystoke closed his eyes. "Yes, the man was executed silently by a consensus of frightened officers. We thought we were saving lives by burying the scandal. I believed we had done the right thing, or at least the necessary thing, but Peter saw it differently. He wanted the truth told. Yes, even after all these years. He said we had stolen something sacred, trust perhaps, or the soul of a man. He wanted to go to the bishop." "And your response?" "I pleaded with him. I reminded him of the reputations it would ruin. Not just mine, others too, families, legacies." "Did you threaten him?" "No, but I warned him about consequences, about division. He left silent. And 2 days later he was dead." Greystoke turned, eyes blazing. "I did not kill him." "No," said Father Brown, "but you helped him to a place where he saw only one path left." A great silence followed. Rain drummed the roof. Somewhere the bell creaked gently in its tower. "Was it pride?" Greystoke asked at last. "Was that the sin?" "No," said Father Brown. "It was fear wearing the mask of honour, but sin often wears medals, my lord." Greystoke sat heavily in a pew. "Then what must I do?" "Confess," said Father Brown, "not only to me, to those who remain, to those whose lives this shadow touches still. Let the truth be the grave marker Peter Alnwick never asked for." The next day dawned pale and breathless. The storm had passed, but the village held its breath as if waiting for something to break the new stillness. At midday, Lord Greystoke summoned the townspeople to the hall. They came in 2s and 3s, shopkeepers, servants, farmers, even a few sceptical teenagers. Veronica Delamere arrived with her sister, pale but composed. Mr. Hollow stood at the back, arms folded. Greystoke addressed them from the hearth. "I have asked you here not to explain but to confess," he began. "What I say will not make what happened right, but it may make it known. And that matters." He spoke plainly, telling of the war, the betrayal, the silencing of the chaplain, the journal, and Peter Alnwick's discovery. He did not spare himself nor shift the weight. When he finished, there was no applause, only a deep, rippling silence. Then from the back, Lucas Hollow spoke. "We were cowards, but today we are not." A few murmured assent. A woman wept quietly into her shawl. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Veronica approached Father Brown outside. "You knew all along." "I suspected," he said, "but truth is not something one shouts from rooftops. It must be unearthed gently, like a root in dry earth." "And justice?" she asked. "Was this justice?" Father Brown tilted his head. "Justice is often noisy. This was something quieter. Perhaps mercy, perhaps repentance." He looked up at the manor. "Peter died because he would not lie. Now the lie is dead too. It is not a happy ending, Miss Delamere. But it is an honest one." She nodded and turned away. Father Brown remained in the lane, the wind tugging at his cassock. The mystery, it seemed, had unravelled, not with the clatter of handcuffs or a courtroom's cry, but with the heavy, trembling voice of a man facing his conscience. He took his umbrella and walked toward the graveyard. The clouds were beginning to break, and a thin shaft of sun reached through the yews to fall gently across the stone where Peter Alnwick lay. He stopped there, murmured a prayer, and looked to the hills. Truth had walked through Skelbrooke. It had not shouted, it had not accused, it had merely knocked on the door and waited. And someone at last had answered. Chapter 8. The Bell and the Silence. The weeks that followed were quiet in Skelbrooke, not with the dead weight of grief, but the hush that follows confession. The village, like a patient long ailing and now diagnosed, moved gently, mended slowly. The shadow of Peter Alnwick's death remained, but it no longer stretched across every face, every doorstep. The truth, at last spoken, had loosened something in the air, like a door left ajar after too many years sealed. Father Brown continued his quiet service at St. Etheldreda's. He led Mass with his usual humility, heard confessions with patient ears, and walked the lanes with his battered umbrella under one arm. He spoke little of what had happened, and those who might have asked found they did not need to. The storm, once broken, had spoken enough. One morning, as frost silvered the windows and the first breath of winter entered the fields, Veronica Delamere came to see him. "You'll be leaving soon?" she asked, seated in the vicarage's narrow parlour, a cup of weak tea steaming in her hand. "Soon, yes," Father Brown said. "Reverend Chatterton is recovering well. He'll return before Advent." Veronica nodded. "And you?" "You'll vanish again, like the mist." "I imagined so," he said with a smile. "I rarely stay long. There is always another soul to stumble across." They sat for a time in companionable silence. "I wanted to thank you," she said at last, "for what you did." "I didn't do very much," Father Brown replied. "I listened and I waited." "You saw what we could not." "No," he said gently. "I saw what you would not let yourselves see, which is quite different." She looked into her teacup. "Do you think he forgave us, Peter?" "I think he understood you," Father Brown answered, "which is the beginning of forgiveness." She left not long after, and Father Brown, ever slow in motion but swift in purpose, made his way to the church. There he climbed once more the narrow stair to the Belfry. The bell hung still, dust gathering at its base, the rope coiled like a sleeping serpent. He examined it again, as he had on that first misty morning. It was now fully repaired. Mr. Hallett had seen to that, but it had not been rung since. He ran his fingers along the groove where the rope passed through the pulley, then looked to the small window that overlooked the graveyard. From this height, the world seemed both smaller and more complete. Behind him, someone cleared their throat. It was Amos Hallett, the verger. "I wasn't sure you'd be up here, Father," he said. "Curiosity is a strong force in old priests," Father Brown replied. Hallett hesitated. "I've been meaning to ask, do you think it was truly suicide?" Father Brown looked at the bell. "It was death by despair, but not despair of life, despair of truth. He felt the truth had no place in this world. That's what killed him." Hallett nodded slowly. "And Greystoke?" "Living still," said Father Brown, "which means the harder part lies ahead, for him." The verger looked out the window. "I suppose it's odd, isn't it, that a bell meant to call us together was the thing from which he hung?" "Not so odd," said Father Brown. "People often twist sacred things into snares. That's one of the darker talents of humanity." He turned, patted the old man's shoulder, and made his way down again. Later that evening, just before dusk, a figure came to the graveyard. Father Brown saw her from the church door, Veronica, in a dark coat, placing something small on Peter's grave. He waited until she left before approaching. It was a book, a thin leather-bound volume of metaphysical poetry. Inside on the flyleaf, a handwritten line in a woman's hand, to Peter, who sought the eternal word beneath mortal silence. Father Brown closed the book and looked upward. Above, the bell rope stirred ever so slightly in the still air. On his final Sunday, Father Brown preached a sermon without notes. The nave was full, though quiet. He did not speak of sin or punishment, nor of crime or sorrow. He spoke of masks, that men wear masks not to deceive others but to convince themselves, that guilt hides often behind honor, cruelty behind logic, and fear behind righteousness. The truth, he said, does not come in the thunder. It comes in the whisper, and sometimes it wears a very plain face. After the service, he shook hands in the porch, his umbrella tucked under one arm, his suitcase already packed in the vicarage hall. Greystoke came to him last. "Will they forgive me?" the old man asked. "Some already have," said Father Brown. "The rest will try, which is more than most deserve." "And you?" Father Brown looked at him with those deep, unblinking eyes. "I never needed to, I only needed to understand." They parted with a nod. As the train pulled away from the small station at dusk, Father Brown sat alone in a corner carriage, watching the hills slip past like folded pages. He murmured a prayer, not for the dead, but for the living, for those who carry truth not as a sword, but as a burden, for those who speak when it would be easier to remain silent, for those who seek God not in thunder or triumph, but in the still, small voice that remains after the bell has ceased its tolling. And Skelbrooke, cradled in the Yorkshire hills, returned to its gentle slumber. The church bell remained silent. But the truth had spoken.